All right, thanks everybody for attending. For those joining by webinar, please write in your questions into the panel in your webinar screen, and I'll try to get to them after I'm done. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, which are listed on the screen, and also the Archbold-UF LTAR group that I work with. So LTAR stands for Long-Term Agro-Ecosystem Research Network, and it's a really exciting network to be a part of. We joined this network in 2014 and received full funding for this effort in 2016. And it's been an extremely rewarding experience to take some of the data that we've collected here and contribute to a national effort that is really interested in looking at the sustainability of ecosystems at the national scale of U.S. agriculture and our agro-ecosystems. So Maria, Raul, Marta, Carolina, and Britt and Bethany are all in the audience here, so just shouting out to them. So I'm going to go into this project that we've been working at Buck Island pretty in depth, but before I do that, I want to talk about the network a little bit. So it's a network of 18 sites that you'll see here on the map spread out across the U.S., and they're all the ones shaded in gray there. And you can see they span multiple croplands and grazing sites across the U.S. And sites were selected based on their representativeness of their location to U.S. agriculture and the existence of long-term data. And our Archbold-UF sites are important to the network because we represent grazing lands in a subtropical region, and this is very different from the rest of the grazing lands that are in the network. And our sites span an intensity gradient. So here in Florida, we have improved pastures, we have semi-native pastures, and we also have native rangeland that are all used for cattle and beef production. And also our locations are in very sensitive watersheds. So on this big map here, you can see the University of Florida RC REC is located in the Peace River Basin, and Archbold Biological Station and Buck Island Ranch, where I work, are located in the headwaters of the Everglades. And the management that we do on the grazing lands in these watersheds are really critical to the water quality flowing out of the watersheds. So the broad network goals are really to focus in on sustainable intensification, which is increasing productivity without negatively impacting the environment. So we know we really need to produce food to feed our population, but we want to increase our productivity without negatively affecting the environment. So the strategic goals of the LTAR network are to feed and clothe the world, stewardship of our resources and environment, and prosperity of rural communities. And the sustainability is seen as a three-legged stool that encompasses these three things. So to do this, the network wants to inform strategies for sustainable intensification by first assessing the current condition of U.S. agriculture. And we do this by using data from all 18 sites across the network to just see what is the condition that our agriculture is in at this current time. And going forward, we are seeking to test alternative technologies and strategies. So we're always looking for that next best thing, that aspirational management that will help us improve productivity and protect the environment. And then thirdly, we want to do modeling to look at forecasting of these intensification outcomes over time. So we want to know, okay, if we're doing this management, how is that going to look in 2050? So the Archbold-UF LTAR research focus is looking at these four main things: factors that drive agricultural productivity and environmental impacts in subtropical grazing ecosystems. trade-offs and synergies among production and ecosystem services. And the things that we're most interested in looking at is productivity, that's related to beef cattle production, greenhouse gas regulation, soil water quality, and protecting biodiversity. And we will be using experiments to assess these management strategies that could encompass grazing, fire, fertilization, mechanical treatment, forage planting, manipulating hydrology, or other types of restoration strategies. And then fourthly, we want to work with our stakeholders to assess socioeconomic barriers to sustainable intensification. So at the network level, most of our group has been working on these large network initiatives. And these are just a few that I've listed here. Regionalization, that group looks at how representative our sites are of US agriculture. Livestock behavior and utilization of our rangelands, and nutrient and water budgets, water quality, phenology, looks at the timing of how our vegetation is greening up and dying back, biodiversity, sustainability of grazing lands, and the common experiment, which I'll explain in a little bit. But this graph shows just an example from the water budget group. And the water budget is important because we look at the inputs coming into our agriculture that comes in through precipitation and irrigation, and the outputs such as evapotranspiration. And what's left over is what's available for agricultural use or people municipal water supply. And if you look at these long-term water budgets over time, you'll see how they're impacted by climatic events or how that water availability varies by season. The common experiment, which I'll be focusing on a lot today and explaining our common experiment at Buck Island Ranch, is the goal is to implement an experiment to compare a business as usual and an aspirational management. So we want to compare basically business as usual is traditionally what we do, and then an aspirational is what we think might be a management strategy we can use to improve productivity. Okay, so now I'm going to start to really focus in on Buck Island Ranch where I work. And before I do that, just wanted to talk about the importance of tropical and subtropical grazed pastures and grasslands and why they're so interesting and why we care about managing them in a different way. So first of all, there is a large land area on Earth that's covered by these subtropical grasslands. 20 to 30% of the total land area in the Americas and Africa is subtropical grasslands. And they have a high carbon sequestration potential. They store greater than 10% of our global terrestrial net productivity and contain 30% of the world's organic carbon in their soils. Greater than 35% of the global methane emissions from natural sources is emitted from soils of the tropics. So methane is a greenhouse gas that's much stronger than carbon dioxide. And these grasslands are grazed, and another major source of methane is from the cows that are grazing them that make a significant contribution to global methane. In these grasslands, typically fire is an important management factor. It's always been sort of a natural process that occurs in these grasslands. And prescribed fires are necessary to maintain grassland vegetation, but they contribute to short-term carbon losses. When you're actually burning the grasslands, there's carbon emitted, but after a fire, that strong regrowth represents a large carbon sink. So ultimately, the net greenhouse gas regulation of grasslands is the balance of the CO2 and the other gases that are emitted and their carbon dioxide sequestration. This is in our watershed, the most common land use in the headwaters of the Everglades. So of the 1.1 million hectares of the watershed, 35% of that is subtropical grazed grasslands. And also we have a strong overlap of agriculture and threatened and endangered species habitat. So our major goal in these grasslands is to understand how traditional and alternative regimes of grazing and fire management affect ecosystem services, including greenhouse gas regulation. So our common experiment currently focuses on manipulating fire and grazing. This is important because previous studies that we worked on only compared grazed versus ungrazed. And we found that grazed pastures have a greater carbon uptake than ungrazed. But we want to add fire into the equation. We know that fire and grazing interact. Animals prefer recently burned areas. This has often been called the magnet effect. And because they prefer these recently burned areas, there can be greater nitrogen input into these recently burned grazed areas. And this may accelerate soil nitrogen cycling and enhance plant nutrient uptake. So what we get is this really interesting mosaic of different vegetation states, and that affects the probability of fire and grazing. So in a recently burned area, we have this high quality and availability of forage, and that has a negative effect on the probability of fire because fuel loads are low, but it has a positive effect on the probability of grazing selection by animals. After a while, that vegetation starts to transition to greater standing biomass. And after 2 to 3 years, grazers typically start to avoid those areas. So there's a negative effect on the probability of selection by grazing animals, but then there's a positive effect on the probability of fire. And what that brings us to is this fire-grazier interaction, which is best described as a shifting mosaic, a landscape with patches that vary with time-sense disturbance. And that shifting mosaic results in heterogeneity of standing biomass that affects grazing behavior and fire behavior. And that standing biomass and that patchiness is thought to be a strong driver of ecosystem function and biodiversity. This has mainly been studied in the southern plains of the US and African savannas, but little work has been done in subtropical grazing lands. So the land management term for harnessing this fire grazing interaction is called patch burn grazing, so PBG. And it's been found to create this heterogeneous vegetation structure that's important to biodiversity. It's really important to grassland birds because some birds use short vegetation and other birds use taller. It can alter fire behavior. It can reduce invasive species and enhance animal populations, and also increase soil nitrogen. So that is what we wanted to look at in our Archbold-UF LTAR common experiment at Buck Island Ranch. And our main goal was to assess how patch burn grazing, or the aspirational treatment, compared to traditional full burn, or business as usual management. And we're mainly looking at cattle behavior, forage productivity and quality, vegetation structure and diversity, soil carbon, and greenhouse gas exchange. And we're working in improved pastures and semi-native pastures. So our main research questions were, how do cattle respond to patch burns in subtropical grasslands? No one's really done this before, so we were wondering if there's going to be that same magnet effect. Are those cattle going to go to the burned areas? How does patch burning affect forage quality and productivity compared to full burns? And we expected forage quality and productivity to be higher in burn patches, but how long does that effect last? Is it just a short-lived effect. Does patch burning increase vegetation diversity and heterogeneity compared to full burns? And how does patch burning affect carbon fluxes? And today I'm going to really focus on the top three questions because we're still working on our carbon data. So our experimental design it uses 16 40-acre pastures on Buck Island Ranch. And the ranch is split into improved and semi-native pastures, so that bright green area in the middle is improved pasture. It's been fertilized, planted with bahia grass, and extensively ditched. And they're much more productive than our semi-native pastures, which are in brown on the map, which have never been fertilized. They're a mixture of native and non-native grasses and less ditched. And there's 8 full burn and 8 patch burns across the ranch. And the red ones are full burns, and then the patch burns are the blue and red pastures. And the yellow circles represent where we have sensors called eddy flux towers that are measuring carbon dioxide and methane. In the improved pastures, we put about 30 head of cattle and rotated them in and out based on grass condition. And in each herd, we have 4 GPS collars, which are collecting data on where the cattle are at all, like every 5 minutes. So these cows were awesome research assistants. They collected a lot of data. In the semi-native pasture, there was 15 head of cattle, and again, they were rotated in and out, and they had 4 GPS collars. And we completed our first prescribed fires in 2017. We did our next set in 2018, and we'll do our final set in 2019. So I'll just sort of explain how this happens in the patch burn treatment. So we divided the pasture, the 16-hectare pasture, into 3 sections. And in winter 2017, we burned a third of it. And then in winter 2018, we burned a second third of it. And in winter 2019, we'll burn the third. And that's sort of what it looks like. So instead of disking a line, we mowed a line because we wanted to not have very much soil disturbance. And in the full burn, we burned all of them in winter 2017. That's based on the prominent type of management that ranchers do in this region. And in both treatments, patch burn and full burn, we maintain the same amount of grazing and fire as the patch burn treatment. So we'll burn the entire pasture once every 3 years. When the patch burn is done, burn 1/3 each year. And there's a picture of one of our full burns. So now we're going to look at some of the data, and this is mainly thanks to Britt Smith, who's a new postdoc here at RC-REC, and Elizabeth Boughton. And Bethany did a lot with these GPS collars. You can see the little white collar on the cow here. And this is just looking at a heat map of cattle grazing use in one PBG pasture and 1 full burn. And the PBG pastures on the left and the full burns on the right. The darker blue is where the cattle are spending most time. And the first thing we did before we did this map was we analyzed the speed of the cattle movement, and we were able to determine when they were grazing based on the speed of their movement. And very light or white means that cattle did not use the area as much. And the dark blue spots on the map here or here or here represent when cattle are really spending a lot of time grazing under trees. In the patch burn, you can see that the cattle there's a more even dark blue across the entire area. So this area was burned in 2017, and you can see their utilization of this pasture is much more even and spread across this patch burned area. And this is looking at the data in a different way. This compares all of the data from the pastures. And this is just improved patch burn pastures. And on the x-axis, we have time. So the burns were done in early February. And then the y-axis shows the proportion of grazing per day. And so after the patch burn fires occurred, we put the cows right in there, and they have the choice of grazing on burned vegetation or unburned. And when they first went in there, they focused on these areas. The black is unburned and the red is burned. So there was a higher proportion of grazing in the unburned area the first couple weeks when they went in there. And then afterwards, they really focused in on these burned areas. The gaps in the map represent when cattle were rotated out of the pasture. The interesting thing about this is that when they went back in May, June, this clump here, they were really utilizing burned and unburned vegetation equally. But then in the later parts of the year, August through October, they're still focusing in and spending a large proportion of their time on the burned areas in these patch burn pastures. And we didn't know this effect would last the whole year, so that was pretty interesting. This is the same data for looking at semi-native patch burns. And the take-home message of this graph is that cattle spent most time grazing in burned patches for about 4 months. But then in the end, at the later part of the year, it looks like they were using them equally. So again, they did have the same pattern where right after the burn, they avoided that burn patch, and then about a few weeks after, they really focused a lot of grazing time on the burned patch. And they did tend to do that for about 4 months. So next, I'm going to look at some forage production and quality data. And the main question was, how do patch burn grazing affect forage production and quality? And we used movable exposure and grazed paired plots. So you can see that in this photo, if it shows up, there's a little circular exposure that excludes cattle, and we clip inside the exposure and outside in a grazed pair plot, and then after we clip, we move them. And every time the cattle are rotated out of the pasture, we go to these exposures and paired plots and clip inside. And we use that data to estimate how forage growth over the year. And we sent the biomass, the tissue, plant tissue, to the UF Forage Evaluation Support Lab to analyze total N, total P, and in vitro organic matter digestibility. So this is just the first year of data from 2017. And on the x-axis, we have FB, which means full burn, patch burn. This is patch burn grazing burned area and patch burn grazing unburned area. The black is improved and the red is semi-native. And on the y-axis, we have pounds per acre. And what we found is that the unburned areas tended to have lower forage growth, but it was nearly significant. It wasn't quite significant. Then this is a graph of crude protein. So we have on the x-axis time since fire in days. So it goes from about 50 to 300 days time since fire. And on the y-axis, we have the percent crude protein on a dry matter basis. And blue is the patch burn grazing burned area. Green is the patch burn grazing unburned area. And pink is the full burn. And you can see very clearly in the early days after fire that the burned and the full burn had higher crude protein than the unburned sector. And that actually lasted for quite a long time, till at least about 200 days post-fire. So you do see that elevated crude protein. last quite a while, and maybe that explains why those cattle activity showed they were focusing on the burned sectors even through the end of the year and the improved pastures. This is 2018 data. This is also crude protein. I just graphed it in a slightly different way, looking at January through August. And orange is the patch burn in 2018. And blue is the full burn, which was burned in 2017. So in 2018, it's been about a year since fire for that blue full burn treatment. And you can see that after the fire, which occurred in late January, early February, there was a peak in crude protein, and that lasted for 3 to 4 months in the burned patches. We also looked at the standing biomass, and this was just the heights. We wanted to know if patch burn grazing does do that, make that expected heterogeneity in vegetation heights across these pastures. And so we have max vegetation height in centimeters on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis we have full burned and 1 year since fire, patch burn 2018, and unburned. And we have both improved and semi-native pastures showing here. And what you can see is that heterogeneity is increased because you have shorter heights in the patch burned areas and these taller heights in 1 year since fire and unburned. And so in the full burn, you don't have that short and tall. And the same thing for the semi-native. You have a mixture of heights in the patch burn pasture and sort of less heterogeneity in the full burn. And this again is important it could be important for plant diversity, bird diversity, insects, and may also be really important for carbon flux. Next, I looked at species composition. So this is an analysis called an ordination, and each symbol represents one-third section of a pasture. And what this graph is showing is when the symbols are close together, it means they have very similar species composition. When they're far apart, they're very different. And so what this is showing is not very surprising. Improved pastures are very different in plant composition than semi-native pastures. And these pictures just show some of the dominant species. So in the improved pastures, we have Bahia grass, of course, and a couple different legume species like a couple different desmodiums and a couple different grasses. And then in the semi-native, we have more at least 3 or 4 different bunch grass types and a lot of different forbs and sedges. And one of the questions was does patch burn grazing affect the heterogeneity of these improved pastures? And so this is zeroing in on improved pasture plant communities. And each of these symbols represents the median of a treatment within that ordination space. And this red is what the species composition looked like before the experiment was implemented. The blue circle encompasses the full burn. And what we're really interested in here is the length of the error bars, because that represents heterogeneity. And the patch burn pastures, which are outlined in orange here, had a lot higher variation in error, suggesting that the patch burn did increase heterogeneity in plant species composition. And then this is all the same graph for semi-native pastures. So the red represents the pre-treatment, and the black represents the full burn treatment. And again, the patch burn pastures had the greatest spread across the graph, which indicates increased heterogeneity. So in summary, patch burns modified cattle behavior as expected. Cattle grazing was more evenly distributed on the burned patches, and cattle spent more time on burned areas. And this effect lasted the whole year and improved pastures. Growth of forage tends to be higher in burned areas, which suggests increased productivity and potentially higher carbon sequestration. Crude protein is higher in burned patches for at least 3 to 4 months and may last longer. For example, in 2017, crude protein was higher for approximately 200 days after fire. And patch burning resulted in greater heterogeneity in species composition and plant heights, with potential implications for grassland bird habitat, plant diversity, and ecosystem function. So our next steps with this project are we're going to continue for 1 more year at least, and then we may start to look at some other management management strategies that we can do on these pastures. We're really excited to analyze greenhouse gas regulation because this is one of the key factors for sustainability of grazing lands. We're going to include an economic impact analysis. So patch burn grazing might be more labor intensive. So we want to take that into account when we're going to make our management recommendations at the end. We want to look at the interaction among all these different outcomes that could occur on pastures. So forage production, forage quality, soil carbon, biodiversity, and look at, is there a trade-off? Where are the big trade-offs occurring? And how does management impact those trade-offs? And lastly, we are going to use a model called Descent that will project these trajectories of ecosystems into the future with climate change projections. And that's it. I just want to acknowledge all the people at Buck Island Ranch that has helped with this project, all our interns, and my collaborators that are at University of Illinois and Cornell and USDA and University of Florida, of course. And I'll take any questions. Yes. We wait for a day that has the appropriate wind direction and not too high, not too fast winds, not too low humidity. We do mow lines to make like a soft fire break. And then what we do is we start with a back burn. So we kind of we do it slowly so we can keep it under control. So we're burning against the wind to start with. And then once we have a really solid back burn, we'll light a head fire. And we haven't had one get out of control yet. So that's good. But it's a little tricky.